The security guard didn't raise his voice. He just pointed at the badge clipped to the man's coat and said, "This area's for honorees only, sir." No fuss, no scene. Just a quiet correction. But how many times does a man have to serve before he's seen as more than just a bystander? The lobby of the Veterans Memorial Hall smelled faintly of old wood polish and folded flags. The morning sun streamed through the glass facade, catching on bronze plaques and casting soft shadows over the names. Staff Sergeant Franklin DeWitt stood near the back, one hand resting on his cane, the other holding a small envelope addressed in elegant cursive. People moved around him, families, dignitaries, a news crew adjusting light panels. On the far wall, a newly unveiled mural displayed the faces of the board members and founders of the DeWitt Foundation. 12 in all, framed in gold. Frank watched as a woman in pearls motioned toward the mural for a group photo. She didn't glance his way. No one did. He didn't step forward. Didn't wave. He just stood there, eyes scanning each familiar face. He had taken 5 of those portraits himself. He'd written the bios on their website. He had led the fundraising for the very wall they were being honored on. But his own photo wasn't there. And no one seemed to notice. Or maybe they noticed and decided it didn't matter. He turned away, slowly, the envelope still sealed in his hand. Inside was a short letter. But he wouldn't read it yet. Not until the applause stopped. Not until the silence told him what the ceremony couldn't. The meeting took place in the second-floor conference room, the one with the long walnut table and framed military commendations hanging along the far wall. The room always stayed too cold, even in spring, and the overhead lights hummed in that way fluorescent bulbs do when they've been left on too long. Staff Sergeant Franklin DeWitt sat near the end of the table, not quite at the head, not quite at the corner, just where they'd told him to sit. Across from him, Malik DeWitt leaned forward, button-down shirt too crisp, his tie slightly off-center. Clarice sat beside him, one manicured hand folded neatly over the other. They had papers in front of them, typed minutes, projected charts, proposed revisions. Everyone else had copies too. Except Frank. His folder was missing. No one looked at him directly when they began. Not really. The room buzzed with polite voices, clipped phrases, modernization strategy, cost-to-impact ratio, legacy adjustment. It wasn't until the vote was called that the weight of it finally settled. 8 hands raised. 1 did not. Frank kept his down. Someone cleared their throat. Clarice reached for a pen, marking something quietly on her agenda. Malik leaned back in his chair and nodded, like he'd just wrapped a quarterly report. No congratulations. No acknowledgement. Frank shifted in his seat. The cane resting against his thigh tapped lightly on the floor, unnoticed. His left hand curled around the edge of the table, knuckles white. But he said nothing. When the motion passed, Malik stood and straightened his jacket. Moving forward, he began, "We'll streamline decision-making to reflect current realities." The others murmured their agreement, their voices a soft echo off the sterile walls. No one asked Frank if he had anything to say. He didn't. Not because he lacked words, but because none of them would have landed where they needed to. Not in that room. As the meeting adjourned, chairs scraped quietly back, papers shuffled, and polite goodbyes filled the air. Frank waited until the room had mostly cleared. He stood slowly, adjusting his coat, and reached for the unopened envelope still tucked inside. He didn't open it. He just slipped it into his inside pocket. Malik passed him on the way out. "We'll keep you looped in on the transition," he said, not stopping. Frank gave a small nod. It didn't reach his eyes. The hallway outside was warm by comparison. He moved slower than usual, hand trailing along the wood-paneled wall, fingertips brushing over old names etched into brass plates. Names of men he'd served with. Men who didn't come home. Men whose stories had built this place. At the end of the hall stood the donor recognition case. Behind the glass, a photo of the founding team, him included, smiled back from 15 years ago. But a new sign had been posted beside it, pending reorganization. Updates coming soon. Frank stood there a moment longer than necessary, his reflection layered faintly over the glass. Then he turned, walked down the stairs without a sound, and stepped out into the soft light of late afternoon. He didn't look back. Frank returned to his office late that afternoon. The sun had shifted low across Madison Avenue, casting long shadows across the fifth-floor windows. Inside, the air was still quiet in the way buildings sometimes are when they've already let go of you. He moved slowly, not because of the cane, but because there was no reason to rush. No one was waiting. The room looked the same. Same framed photos on the wall. Same desk he'd sanded by hand when the foundation first opened. But something in the air had changed. Like the furniture already knew he didn't belong here anymore. He sat at the desk without turning on the lamp. The natural light was enough. Just enough. One drawer clicked open. Inside were files, old ones, on families, donors, surviving spouses, stories he'd kept not because they were valuable, but because they were meaningful. Notes in his handwriting. Margins filled with details other people didn't think to ask, who cried quietly during their interview, who requested no public recognition, who sent birthday cards each year even when the letters came back unopened. Frank pulled the drawer all the way out and set the files on the desk in 3 neat stacks. His fingers moved slowly, lightly, not rifling, remembering. He didn't take the desk nameplate. He didn't touch the medals on the wall. But from the bottom drawer, beneath the VA forms and archived meeting minutes, he reached for a small, worn notebook bound in faded leather. Inside, his own shorthand. A map of trust. Not digital. Not replicable. Just names, stories, timelines, human things. The last thing he removed was a folded scrap of yellow paper, creased, nearly translucent at the folds. On it, a list of first donors. 12 names. Some crossed out, with small XS. Not to erase. Just to honor. They were gone now. He packed only what fit in his canvas satchel. The bag wasn't full. Before he left, he looked around once more. The room was untouched, but quieter somehow. Like the absence had already begun. Outside, the hallway lights buzzed faintly. Frank walked past closed doors, past plaques, past framed proclamations, and took the stairs one step at a time. On the second-floor landing, he paused near the framed mission statement. He didn't read it. The front desk was empty. Miranda must have gone for the day. A sticky note on the monitor read back in 10, but 10 had come and gone. Frank left his keycard and name badge neatly on the reception counter. Next to them, he placed a single envelope, sealed, unaddressed. Then he stepped out onto the sidewalk. The city was still moving. People in suits talking into headsets. Tourists checking maps. No one noticed the man in the dark coat with the canvas bag. And Frank didn't wave. Didn't look back. He had taken nothing of theirs. only what was his to begin with. The new reception desk was made of frosted glass and brushed steel. It gleamed under the recessed lights, cold and precise, like the rest of the renovations. A young man sat behind it now, wearing earbuds and typing into a tablet. He didn't look up when the woman from Veterans Affairs arrived. She waited, then cleared her throat gently. He glanced at her badge and waved toward the elevator without speaking. Upstairs, the third-floor archives had been rearranged. Labels once handwritten in blue ink were now color-coded printouts. Boxes that once carried names of battalions were relabeled by region, Midwest, Southeast, Pacific. It looked clean, streamlined, easier to search, but harder to feel. Clarice DeWitt stood by the glass partition, watching two interns load display cases for an upcoming exhibit. She wore a navy blazer and heels that barely made a sound on the polished floor. From a distance, everything looked successful. Polished. Professional. But something was missing. The calls had started quietly. A donor here. A widow there. Asking why the tribute photo was gone. Why no one followed up after their last visit. Asking for someone named Frank. One by one, those questions were forwarded. But there were fewer answers now. Malik DeWitt sat in his corner office, 2 floors above. A spreadsheet open on one monitor, a crisis email flashing on another. The March funding round had come in light. 2 major sponsors hadn't renewed. He scrolled past the numbers, paused on the name of one lapsed donor. A red note beside it read, "Says they only worked with Franklin." He leaned back in his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Outside his window, a banner hung from a neighboring building honoring those who served. A PR campaign Clarice had pushed last fall. It had cost $28,000. The returns were still pending. Downstairs, a staff member fumbled during a tour, misidentifying a photograph in the Hall of Stories. The plaque read First Gold Star Family Gathering, 2009. A visitor asked who had organized it. The guide hesitated, then offered a rehearsed line about team effort. But someone in the back muttered, that was DeWitt's doing. No one corrected them. The lobby felt larger now, though nothing had changed in square footage. Just fewer people staying long. More glances exchanged. More silences unfilled. That afternoon, the digital newsletter went out. The editor had removed a section titled From the Founder's Desk. There was no formal reason. It simply hadn't been updated in months. No one noticed at first. Then one of the older volunteers replied, "Is Frank all right? Haven't seen his column lately." Her message wasn't answered. At 5:12 p.m., the automatic lights flickered off in the back hallway. Motion sensors didn't catch anyone moving. Because no one was. The foundation stayed open until 6. But most had already gone. The walls were still covered in framed medals, photographs, and printed quotes. But the names behind them felt thinner now. Like someone had pressed delete on the parts that didn't fit the new narrative. And the house, though full of history, no longer remembered who built it. Frank rented a small office above a barber shop on Lenox Avenue. The stairs creaked on the way up, and the heat clicked loudly in the mornings, but the windows opened wide and let in the kind of light that made you feel like you weren't hiding. He furnished it simply: 1 desk, 2 chairs, a coffee pot that never quite got hot enough, and a wooden filing cabinet that still smelled faintly of turpentine. On the wall behind him, he hung only one thing, an old brass stamp. The same one he'd used during the early years, back when he still signed every certificate of remembrance by hand. It wasn't fancy. Just a circular press, worn at the edges. But it had weight. Clients didn't line up at first. There were no big announcements. No launch emails or ribbon cuttings. Just quiet calls, most of them in the evening. A widow who'd lost her connection at the foundation. A veteran's daughter looking for a missing archive photo. A chaplain from North Carolina who'd worked with Frank years back and remembered something about the way you listened. He didn't advertise. He just answered. Word traveled slowly, the way truth does when it doesn't need headlines. A former board member called one morning, asking if Frank could review a set of service documents. They'd been misfiled, and no one at the new office could quite decipher the timeline. Frank didn't ask why they hadn't gone through official channels. He just said to drop them off. Sometimes, people didn't even need help. They just came to talk. Veterans who'd aged into silence. Widows who didn't want to feel like their memories were outdated. Frank kept a notebook open during those visits. Not for records. Just to let them see him writing something down, proof that their words weren't being lost. One afternoon, Danielle stopped by after class. She brought sandwiches and a brown envelope, both handled with care. She didn't ask about the new clients or how the rent got paid. She just sat, unwrapped her lunch, and looked around the room. "It's quieter here," she said. Frank nodded. He didn't say it aloud, but this was a different kind of war. No medals. No formations. Just a slow reclaiming of what had always belonged to those who remembered why it mattered. That evening, he turned off the lights by hand. The hallway outside buzzed faintly with neon. He paused, keys in one hand, palm resting on the doorframe. The stamp on the wall caught the last light of day, casting a faint circle of shadow on the wood paneling. It wasn't about revenge. It was about remembering. And making sure someone else could too. It started with a voicemail from Bryce Langston, his voice smooth, professional, almost casual. He mentioned a conversation worth having and a path forward that honors everyone. The kind of language that floats above the truth like mist over cold water. Frank didn't return the call. 2 days later, Clarice sent an email. Short. Tense between the lines. She wrote that the foundation valued continuity and respected his legacy. She asked if he might consider a brief visit to discuss ways to reconnect with long-standing relationships. Frank read it twice, then let the screen go dark. He didn't reply. Then Malik called. The number flashed once, then again. Frank let it ring. Let it fall quiet. The silence that followed was heavier than the call itself. On the third day, a letter arrived. Hand-delivered. No postage. Thick paper. Official letterhead. A signature at the bottom that looked practiced but not familiar. It invited Frank to return in an advisory capacity and attend an upcoming board meeting to help shape the foundation's evolving mission. Frank sat with the letter for a while. Not reading it again. Just holding it. The weight of the page wasn't much, but the offer carried something different. Not apology. Not even respect. Just need. That evening, he walked down to the corner store. The man behind the counter nodded, same as always, and asked if he wanted his usual. Frank said yes. He waited while the register printed slowly, the receipt curling like steam before it settled. Outside, dusk had set in. The streetlights buzzed faintly, not yet fully awake. Frank leaned against the bench outside the laundromat. Plastic bags rustled nearby. A bus sighed at the intersection. He didn't feel triumphant. Didn't feel like he'd won anything. Just stood there, the letter folded in his coat pocket, untouched since morning. A woman walked by with a child in a stroller. The boy pointed at the worn patch on Frank's sleeve where a unit insignia used to be. The mother didn't look. She just kept walking. Frank sat down on the bench. Took a slow breath. He could have gone back. Could have sat at that long table again. Let them nod and smile and pretend nothing had ever gone missing. But some things, once gone, don't come back the same. When he returned to his office, the lights inside were still off. The brass stamp on the wall caught the last glint of twilight. He didn't turn on the switch. Just stepped in and let the quiet fill the space again. The letter stayed in his coat pocket. Unopened. There were things he could still do. But none of them required permission. The memorial event was held in the same atrium where Franklin DeWitt once welcomed every Gold Star family by name. Now, the banners were different. Brighter. Professionally designed. Someone had installed a lighted backdrop that shifted colors slowly from blue to gold. It hummed faintly behind the podium. Chairs were arranged in rows, 4 sections wide. A few donors in the front. Mid-tier staff scattered in the middle. Families in the back. A screen to the left looped a photo slideshow, fading between black and white portraits, medals, folded flags. No narration. Just music that barely filled the space. Private First Class Malik DeWitt stood at the edge of the stage, glancing at his notes. Clarice DeWitt adjusted his jacket cuff and whispered something only he could hear. He nodded once, kept his head down. Bryce Langston paced near the media table, checking the schedule against a stack of printed press packets. Frank wasn't there. Not in the room. Not in the program. Not in the slideshow. At 6:08 p.m., the lights dimmed, and the crowd settled. Malik stepped to the microphone, thanked the attendees, introduced the Foundation's mission in its next chapter. He spoke clearly. Said all the right words. But there was a stillness in the room that wouldn't leave. A quiet not caused by respect, but by absence. Then came the unexpected sound of footsteps on the side steps. Danielle "Danny" DeWitt walked to the stage from the floor, not the backstage curtain. She wasn't listed on the program. She wore no name badge. Just a plain black blouse, a necklace of 3 gold rings, and in her hand, a folded sheet of paper. She didn't look at the podium. She looked at the people. Row by row. Then she spoke. My name is Danielle DeWitt. Some of you know me. Some of you may not. But you've probably heard of my grandfather. The room held its breath. He wasn't invited tonight. And neither was his name. But you walked past his work on the way in. You sat under the ceiling he raised funds to rebuild. You're watching a slideshow made possible by his database, one he built in his spare time, by hand, with notes from families who didn't want to be statistics. No one moved. I came here tonight not to protest, and not to shame. I came to remember. Because silence doesn't protect legacy. It erases it. She paused. Looked at Malik DeWitt, then down at the sheet in her hand. And I can't be part of that anymore. She stepped down. Didn't return to her seat. She walked out of the atrium, through the back hall, past the framed mission statement. A few turned their heads to watch. No one called after her. Later, when the press asked about the moment, the official statement said, "We support diverse perspectives. But those who were in the room will tell you something else. That the only time the place felt honest was when she spoke and left in silence." Franklin DeWitt didn't show up to the building the next day or the day after. No announcements. No press releases. Just his name, still missing from the lobby plaque, still missing from the website. But something changed quietly, like a window cracked open in his still room. 3 days later, a folded envelope arrived at the office of Aunt Geneva Ellis. No stamp. Just the old foundation emblem embossed faintly in the corner. Inside, a single note in his handwriting. "I didn't build it for credit. I built it so no mother would sit alone." Geneva didn't forward it. She placed it on her bookshelf, next to a framed photo of Frank in uniform, standing beside a line of folding chairs under a rain tarp, his hand on a widow's shoulder. That same week, Danielle DeWitt submitted a formal petition to the National Archive of Military Legacy Foundations, requesting a review of documentation regarding early founding members of the Memorial Initiative. It didn't carry any accusation. It simply included timelines, emails, handwritten meeting notes, and one photograph. Frank, younger, in a worn blue shirt, seated at a folding table with a list of 103 names in front of him. Names that weren't yet carved in stone. No press covered the petition. No statements were issued. But staff noticed when Bryce Langston stopped speaking on record. Clarice DeWitt began declining interviews. And Malik DeWitt, once poised, composed, left a meeting midway through, saying only that he needed to get some air. And then, slowly, word began to return. First from an older volunteer who started asking where the honor wall went. Then from a donor who asked why they'd never heard the story of the man who coordinated Gold Star outreach for 15 years without drawing a salary. The questions didn't come in anger. They came in whispers. Gentle. Relentless. By month's end, a small plaque appeared in the East Corridor. Not at the front. Not in lights. Just brushed bronze, mounted chest high, where a person would need to pause to see it. In honor of Staff Sergeant Franklin "Frank" DeWitt. Co-founder, quiet builder, relentless keeper of memory. He didn't ask for thanks. But he never forgot their names. Frank never walked by to see it. But Danielle did. So did Geneva. And later that week, a quiet figure in a gray coat stood beside it for almost 5 minutes. A visitor with a familiar limp, a quiet breath, and hands that stayed in his pockets. He read every word. And when a passing janitor nodded at him, he nodded back. Nothing more was said. But from that day forward, the hallway never felt forgotten again. Because what's built in honor, quietly, patiently, without ego, can't be broken by those who only ever wanted to be seen. Some names don't need to be shouted to be remembered. Franklin "Frank" DeWitt built something meant to comfort others, not elevate himself. He never asked for recognition, only that the fallen be remembered and their families never sit alone in silence. And yet, when his name was removed, it wasn't outrage that brought it back. It was quiet truth. Quiet dignity. The kind that lives in handwritten notes, whispered memories, and the eyes of those who knew what he stood for. This story reminds us, true legacy isn't built through titles or press releases, it's built through constancy, humility, and doing the right thing even when no one is looking. And when people forget, the truth has a way of finding its voice again. Not loud. Not angry. Just steady. If you've ever watched someone you love build something quietly, be it a home, a family, or a legacy, this story is for you. Do you believe honor can outlast ego? Let us know in the comments, and if this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to Black Veteran Stories, where quiet strength finds its voice.